Years ago today that the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, killing all 7 astronauts on board, including the first person picked to be a teacher in outer space, Kristen McCullough.
Our friend and former 9 News anchor Gary Shapiro and photojournalist Manny Sotelo remember where they were that day.
For nearly 40 years, the world believed a lie. When Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch, we were told the astronauts died instantly. No pain, no awareness, just gone. But classified evidence tells a different story. Manually activated oxygen packs, circuit breakers moved by human hands, a crew cabin that stayed intact.
Talking to the families, importantly, NASA did recover many pieces of wreckage back in 1986, including the remains of the crew. If they leave this piece in place, then there's the risk of scavenger hunters coming in and trying to recover it. Nobody wants that. And NASA has an Office of Lessons Learned about every fatal incident.
What NASA never wanted you to know is that the explosion didn't kill them. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, 7 people fell from the edge of space, fully conscious, fully aware, trapped in a tumbling metal coffin with no way out. For nearly 4 decades, most people have carried a single image in their minds when they think of Challenger. A bright fireball blooming against a clear blue sky. 2 solid rocket boosters spiraling away in opposite directions, debris trailing downward from an altitude of nearly 15 kilometers. The immediate conclusion, repeated across every news channel that morning and embedded in public memory ever since, was simple and final. The shuttle exploded. The crew died instantly. This narrative became more than just a news story. It transformed into a kind of collective understanding, a shared truth that helped millions of people process an unthinkable tragedy. The idea of instantaneous death carried with it a measure of comfort. There was no suffering, no awareness, no time to be afraid. The astronauts were there one moment, and in the next moment, they were gone. It was the most merciful version of events anyone could hope for under such circumstances. But technical evidence tells a different story, one that NASA has been reluctant to emphasize in public discussions of the disaster. The reality of what happened to the 7 people aboard Challenger is considerably more complex and significantly more disturbing than the version most of us learned. The first step in understanding their fate requires us to examine what actually occurred at the 73rd second of flight. The word explosion has been used so universally that it seems almost pedantic to question it. Yet from an engineering and physics standpoint, that word fundamentally misrepresents what took place. An explosion, in the technical sense, involves a supersonic shockwave that destroys everything within its radius almost instantaneously. Think of a bomb detonating or a fuel tank igniting all at once. The destructive force radiates outward faster than the human eye can follow, obliterating structures in fractions of a second. What happened to Challenger was not that kind of event. According to the Rogers Commission, which investigated the disaster in exhaustive detail, the shuttle underwent what engineers call a structural breakup. The distinction matters enormously when we consider what happened to the people inside. The failure began with a component most people had never heard of before that day. An O-ring seal on the right solid rocket booster. These rubber rings were designed to prevent hot gases from escaping through the joints of the booster segments. On that particular morning, with temperatures near freezing at the launch site, the O-rings had lost much of their flexibility. When Challenger lifted off, hot gases began leaking through the compromised seal almost immediately. 58 seconds into the flight, cameras captured a small flame emerging from the side of the right booster. That flame grew into a blowtorch, a focused jet of superheated gas that began cutting into the structure of the external fuel tank like a welding torch through sheet metal. The tank held more than 2,000 tons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, stored in separate compartments under tremendous pressure. At 73 seconds, the flame burned through the lower strut that connected the right booster to the external tank. The booster, no longer anchored properly, pivoted on its upper attachment point and its nose smashed into the liquid oxygen tank. The impact ruptured the tank's structure. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, kept carefully separated under normal circumstances, suddenly mixed and ignited. What observers saw from the ground was the rapid, almost explosive release of energy as the propellants combined. A massive fireball formed as the external tank came apart. It looked and felt like an explosion because the release of energy was violent and sudden. But within that expanding cloud of fire and vapor, something crucial was happening that most people never learned about. the space shuttle was not a single, unified vehicle. It was an assembly of components attached together. The orbiter, the part that looked like an airplane, was where the crew lived and worked. It was connected to the massive external fuel tank, which in turn was connected to the two solid rocket boosters on either side. When the structural failure occurred, aerodynamic forces tore this assembly apart at its weakest points. The wings of the orbiter were relatively thin and designed for the vacuum of space and controlled re-entry. Under the sudden and chaotic aerodynamic loads at an altitude of 14 kilometers and a speed approaching Mach 2, they disintegrated. The payload bay doors tore away. The main engines ripped free from their mounting points. The tail section broke off, but there was one part of the shuttle that was built much stronger than everything else: the crew cabin. This forward section of the orbiter was constructed from reinforced aluminum, designed to maintain pressure in the vacuum of space and to protect the astronauts during the violent forces of launch and landing. According to NASA's post-accident analysis, the cabin did not rupture or disintegrate when the shuttle broke apart. It separated from the rest of the vehicle, largely intact. High-speed tracking camera footage, analyzed frame by frame in the months after the accident, shows something that contradicts the explosion narrative. The crew cabin can be seen emerging from the fireball, continuing upward on its own momentum. It did not vaporize in the flames. It did not shatter into fragments. It flew free as a single piece, carrying 7 people inside. This is where the public understanding and the physical reality begin to diverge in a profound way. While millions of people watching on television that morning assumed the astronauts had perished in the fireball, the crew cabin was beginning a journey that would last another 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 165 seconds during which the physical laws of motion and gravity played out with absolute indifference to the lives at stake. The cabin did not fall immediately. It was traveling upward at tremendous speed when it separated. Basic physics dictated what happened next. An object in motion continues in motion until acted upon by an outside force. In this case, that outside force was gravity. The cabin followed a ballistic trajectory, like a ball thrown into the air. It continued climbing for several more seconds, reaching an altitude even higher than the point of breakup before the upward motion finally stopped and it began to fall. This is perhaps the most difficult fact to absorb. After the shuttle broke apart at 48,000 feet, the crew cabin climbed higher still to approximately 65,000 feet, nearly 20 kilometers above the Atlantic Ocean. At that peak, there was a brief moment of near weightlessness, a pause between ascent and descent. Then gravity asserted itself, and the cabin began falling back toward Earth. The entire sequence, from separation to ocean impact, lasted just under 3 minutes. During that time, a question has haunted investigators, historians, and family members. Were the astronauts conscious? Did they know what was happening? For years, NASA allowed the public to believe that consciousness was impossible, that the forces involved, or perhaps sudden depressurization, would have rendered the crew unconscious or killed them instantly. It was a compassionate assumption, and many people accepted it without question. But evidence recovered from the ocean floor weeks after the disaster painted a very different picture, one that NASA has never fully emphasized in public statements, but that exists in technical reports and testimony for anyone willing to look. That evidence begins with what Navy divers found when they finally located and recovered portions of the crew cabin from the floor of the Atlantic. Among the wreckage, amid the twisted metal and damaged equipment, they discovered something that changed everything investigators thought they knew about those final moments. The implications were so significant that they would reshape our entire understanding of what the crew experienced after Challenger broke apart. When Navy divers finally reached the crew cabin wreckage on the ocean floor, they were faced with a grim task. The cabin had been crushed by the impact, and the recovery operation was conducted with extreme care and sensitivity. But as the debris was brought to the surface and examined by investigators, certain details emerged that would fundamentally alter the official understanding of the disaster. Among the recovered items were the personal emergency oxygen packs, known officially as personal egress air packs. These were small portable breathing devices that each crew member had available in the cabin. They were not part of the shuttle's main life support system. Instead, they were backup devices designed for use during ground emergencies, situations like a fire in the cabin before launch or toxic fumes during preparations. Each pack contained enough oxygen for roughly 6 minutes of breathing. The critical detail that investigators discovered was this: 4 of the 7 packs had been activated. More importantly, these devices were not designed to turn on automatically. There was no sensor that would detect a problem and activate them without human intervention. To get oxygen flowing from these packs, someone had to perform a specific manual action. Depending on the pack design, this meant either pulling a metal ring or flipping a mechanical switch. It required a deliberate, conscious decision and the physical capability to carry it out. The pack belonging to Commander Dick Scobie, seated in the commander's position on the left side of the flight deck, was found in the off position. But the pack belonging to pilot Michael Smith, seated to Scobie's right, had been activated. 2 other packs belonging to crew members in the mid-deck area below had also been turned on. The 4th activated pack was found separated from its crew member, making it impossible to determine who had been using it. This discovery represented something more than just a technical finding. It was proof of consciousness. For these switches to have been moved, for these packs to have been activated, at least some of the crew members had to have been alive and aware after the shuttle broke apart. They had to have enough presence of mind to recognize that they needed emergency oxygen. They had to be able to locate the packs in what must have been a chaotic and terrifying environment, and they had to possess sufficient motor control to operate small mechanical devices while the cabin tumbled through the sky. The implications of this evidence created significant difficulties for NASA's preferred narrative. For months after the disaster, the agency had emphasized uncertainty about the crew's fate, while simultaneously allowing the public to assume that death had been instantaneous. The oxygen pack evidence made that assumption untenable. The Rogers Commission report, released several months after the accident, acknowledged the activated packs but treated the information with notable caution. The report stated that the findings suggested some crew members were alive after the breakup, but stopped short of declaring definitively that they remained conscious throughout. The fall. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a physician and former astronaut who led the biomedical analysis of the crew remains, approached the question carefully in his official report. His medical examination found no evidence of lethal injuries that would have occurred during the structural breakup itself. No crushing trauma. No catastrophic wounds from flying debris. The fatal injuries, he determined, came at impact with the ocean's surface. This meant that for the entire descent, the crew members were not dealing with immediately life-threatening physical trauma from the breakup. The question then became one of consciousness. Could they have remained aware throughout the fall, or would other factors have rendered them unconscious shortly after separation? 2 main scenarios could cause loss of consciousness in this situation: extreme gravitational forces or sudden depressurization of the cabin. Regarding G-forces, analysis of the breakup sequence showed that while the initial loads were significant, they were not catastrophic. When the shuttle came apart, the crew cabin experienced forces estimated at 12 to 20 times normal gravity for a brief moment. This sounds extreme, and it would certainly be uncomfortable and disorienting. But astronauts are trained to tolerate high G-forces. Fighter pilots regularly experience sustained forces of 9 Gs during maneuvers. The space shuttle itself subjected crews to 3 Gs during normal launch and re-entry. The forces at breakup were higher, but they occurred for only a fraction of a second before the cabin entered freefall. Within seconds, the G loading dropped to essentially 0 as the cabin fell freely through the atmosphere. The second possibility, rapid depressurization, seemed more likely at first. If the cabin had ruptured when it separated from the shuttle, the sudden loss of air pressure at an altitude of 48,000 feet would have been catastrophic. At that altitude, the air pressure is only about 1/7 of what it is at sea level. Human beings cannot maintain consciousness in such thin air without supplemental oxygen. If the cabin had lost pressure instantly, the crew would have had perhaps 10 to 15 seconds of useful consciousness before blacking out. But structural analysis of the recovered cabin tells a different story. While the cabin was severely damaged by the ocean impact, engineers could still examine how the pressure vessel had been constructed and where the failure points were. Their conclusion was significant. The cabin appeared to have maintained pressure integrity during the separation and the initial portion of the descent. The aluminum structure, designed to hold pressure in space, was strong enough to survive the breakup without immediately rupturing. This finding aligned with the oxygen pack evidence in a troubling way. If the cabin had depressurized instantly, there would have been no reason for crew members to activate emergency oxygen packs. They would have lost consciousness too quickly to react. The fact that multiple packs were activated suggested that the crew had time to assess their situation and take action. They were breathing, they were thinking, they were aware. Michael Smith's actions provide the most detailed evidence of this awareness. Smith was an experienced Navy pilot with more than 4,000 hours of flight time, including carrier landings and combat missions. The pilot's position on the shuttle was directly to the right of the commander, surrounded by instruments, controls, and electrical panels. When investigators examined the wreckage from Smith's station, they found something that went beyond the oxygen pack activation. They found evidence of attempted troubleshooting. Several circuit breakers on the electrical panel near Smith's position had been moved from their original settings. These were not switches on the main control panels visible in front of the pilots. They were breakers located on a side panel, typically covered by protective guards to prevent accidental activation during flight. The breakers controlled power distribution to various shuttle systems, including flight controls and display screens. The significance of this cannot be overstated. These breakers were not the kind of switches you might bump accidentally. Changing their position required deliberate effort. You had to reach to the side panel, move or remove the protective cover, and physically push or pull the breaker itself. This was not a reflex action. It was an intentional attempt to restore power to systems that had gone dark when the cabin separated from the shuttle's main electrical supply. Put yourself in that position for a moment. You are strapped into a seat in a spacecraft. Everything has just gone wrong in the most violent way imaginable. The vehicle has broken apart around you. You're in free fall. And your training, your thousands of hours of experience, your muscle memory, all of it tells you to do something. Restore power, regain control, fix the problem. Michael Smith, in those moments of chaos and terror, did what pilots do. He tried to fly the aircraft. He worked on the problem. Of course, there was no solution. The crew cabin had no engines, no control surfaces, no way to alter its trajectory. It was aerodynamically unstable, designed to be part of a larger vehicle, not to fly independently. Once separated from the orbiter's wings and main structure, it could only fall. But Smith's actions were not about the possibility of success. They were about human instinct in crisis. The refusal to give up, even when reason suggests there is no hope. The forensic team led by Dr. Kerwin examined these findings with great care. His report acknowledged that at least some crew members had survived the initial breakup and retained consciousness for an unknown period during the descent. But the report was also notably restrained in its conclusions. Kerwin noted that the exact sequence of events and the duration of consciousness could not be determined with certainty. The lack of more detailed information was partly due to the physical destruction of evidence during the ocean impact, but it also reflected NASA's reluctance to speculate about the crew's subjective experience. What we are left with is a body of physical evidence that points to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. The crew of Challenger did not die in 73 seconds. They did not perish in a sudden explosion. They survived the breakup. They activated emergency equipment. They attempted to restore control. And they did all of this while trapped in a powerless metal shell, tumbling through the sky at hundreds of kilometers per hour, with no possibility of rescue and no way to change their fate. For at least some period of time, they were fully aware of what was happening to them. This awareness, this consciousness during the fall, represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire tragedy. It transforms the disaster from a sudden technical failure into something more psychologically complex. These were not passive victims who simply vanished in an instant. They were active participants in their own final moments, struggling against a reality that could not be altered, breathing emergency oxygen while the cabin tumbled and the ocean grew closer with every passing second. The crew cabin separated from the shuttle at an altitude of approximately 48,000 feet, roughly 14.5 kilometers above the Atlantic Ocean. At that moment, it was traveling upward at tremendous velocity, still carrying the momentum imparted by the shuttle's engines during the first 73 seconds of flight. The laws of physics that govern falling objects are absolute and predictable. An object thrown upward will continue rising until gravity overcomes its velocity, bringing it to a momentary stop before it begins to descend. This is exactly what happened to the cabin. It did not immediately plummet toward the ocean. Instead, it followed a high arcing trajectory, continuing to climb even as the shuttle's main components were being torn apart by aerodynamic forces and scattered across the sky. The cabin reached a peak altitude estimated at 65,000 feet, approximately 20 kilometers above the Earth's surface. At that height, the crew compartment was at the edge of the stratosphere, higher than most commercial aircraft ever fly, in air so thin that an unprotected human would lose consciousness in seconds. At the apex of that arc, there would have been a brief moment when the cabin's upward motion ceased entirely. A fraction of a second when vertical velocity reached zero before gravity began pulling it back down. In that instant, the crew would have experienced something close to weightlessness, the same sensation astronauts feel in orbit. But unlike the controlled weightlessness of space, this was the weightlessness of freefall, the pause, before the long drop back to Earth. Then the descent began. From an altitude of 20 kilometers to sea level, the fall lasted approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 165 seconds. To put that duration in perspective, it is enough time to read several pages of a book, enough time to have a brief conversation, enough time to understand fully what is happening and to know that there is no escape. The cabin was not designed to fly on its own. It had no wings, no engines, no aerodynamic surfaces to provide control or stability. Its shape was irregular, with mass distributed unevenly throughout the structure. Seats, equipment, human beings, all positioned in ways that made the center of gravity unpredictable once the cabin separated from the larger vehicle. The result was that the cabin began to tumble as it fell. Imagine being inside that metal shell. 7 people strapped into their seats, some on the upper flight deck, others in the mid-deck compartment, below. The cabin's spinning on multiple axes simultaneously, rotating and pitching in ways that would have been completely disorienting. Through the windows, normally offering a clear view of Earth or space, they would have seen only chaos. Streaks of blue sky and white clouds whipping past at dizzying speed. The horizon is spinning, appearing and disappearing, the sun flashing through the windows in irregular pulses as the cabin rotated. There would have been no stable reference point, no way to orient themselves to which direction was up or down. The sound inside would have evolved as the cabin dropped lower into a denser atmosphere. At high altitude, the air is thin and sound travels differently, but as the cabin fell, the atmosphere grew progressively thicker. The whistle of air moving past the hull would have become a roar. The metal structure would have groaned and creaked under increasing aerodynamic pressure. Any loose objects inside the cabin would have been thrown about by the tumbling motion. The noise level would have risen continuously as the descent speed increased, eventually exceeding 320 kilometers per hour. During this entire sequence, based on the evidence of the activated oxygen packs and the altered circuit breakers, at least some members of the crew remained conscious. They were experiencing this fall with full awareness. The emergency oxygen packs were functioning, providing breathable air. The cabin, having maintained pressure integrity during the initial separation, was not subjecting them to the deadly effects of high-altitude depressurization. They were strapped into their seats, secured by harnesses designed to keep them safe during the normal forces of launch and landing, but now serving only to keep them in place during an uncontrolled tumble toward the ocean. The psychological dimension of this experience defies easy description. These were highly trained professionals, people who had spent years preparing for spaceflight. They understood physics and trajectories. They knew exactly what a fall from 20 kilometers meant. They could calculate in their heads, even under stress, roughly how long they had before impact. They knew there were no parachutes. The shuttle's crew cabin had never been equipped with any kind of emergency separation system or independent landing capability. It was designed to remain attached to a vehicle that could glide back to a runway. Without wings, without engines, there was simply no mechanism for survival. The absolute helplessness of that situation is difficult to fully comprehend. In most emergency scenarios, even catastrophic ones, there is usually something you can try to do. A pilot whose engines fail still has the option to glide and look for a place to land. A mountaineer whose rope breaks can attempt to arrest the fall. A sailor on a sinking ship can try to reach a lifeboat. But the Challenger crew had no options. They could breathe, they could think, they could move their hands and activate switches, but none of those actions could change their trajectory. They were passengers in a doomed vessel with no controls and no possible intervention that could save them. Yet even knowing this, Michael Smith worked the circuit breakers. He tried to restore power to systems that, even if they had been functional, could not have helped. This speaks to something fundamental about human nature in crisis situations. We continue to act even when action is futile. We continue to try even when hope is absent. It is both admirable and heartbreaking. While this experience was unfolding in the tumbling cabin over the Atlantic, a very different process was taking place on the ground. Within minutes of the breakup, NASA officials were faced with an enormous communication challenge. Millions of people had watched the disaster unfold on live television. The images of the fireball and the diverging rocket trails were being replayed continuously on every news channel. The agency needed to provide information to a shocked public, but it also needed to control the narrative in ways that would preserve confidence in the space program and protect the families of the crew from unnecessary additional trauma. The first critical phrase came from NASA Public Affairs Officer Steve Nesbitt, whose voice had been providing commentary during the launch broadcast. Moments after the breakup, Nesbitt spoke the words that would be repeated in news reports for years to come. Obviously, a major malfunction. The phrase was simultaneously accurate and carefully neutral. It acknowledged that something had gone terribly wrong without specifying what had happened to the crew. It left room for uncertainty, for the possibility that perhaps not everything was lost, even though anyone watching the screen knew the truth. In the hours and days that followed, NASA's communication strategy became clearer. The agency chose to focus public attention very specifically on the technical cause of the failure. Engineers and officials discussed the O-ring seals, the cold temperatures at the launch site, and the dynamics of hot gas leakage. Press conferences became detailed technical briefings about rubber compounds, joint rotation, pressure differentials, and design flaws. The more the public discussion centered on these mechanical details, the less it focused on the human dimension of the tragedy. This was not accidental. By directing attention toward technical problems that could be analyzed, understood, and eventually fixed, NASA accomplished several goals simultaneously. It demonstrated that the agency was taking the disaster seriously and working to prevent future occurrences. It reassured the public that spaceflight was fundamentally safe and that this disaster resulted from a specific, correctable flaw rather than some inherent danger in the enterprise. And perhaps most importantly, it kept the conversation at a comfortable emotional distance from the most disturbing questions. What did the astronauts experience? When did they die? Were they aware? NASA officials consistently used language that suggested the disaster had been swift and final. References to the event occurring at great altitude, to everything happening very quickly, to the impossibility of survival. These phrases appeared repeatedly in public statements and official reports. They were not technically false, but they created an impression that discouraged deeper inquiry. If everything happened quickly at high altitude, the natural assumption was that the crew died at the moment of breakup. There was no reason for the public to imagine a prolonged fall or to consider the possibility of consciousness during descent. The agency's handling of the physical evidence reflected the same careful approach. When Navy divers located the crew cabin on the ocean floor, the recovery operation was conducted with maximum security. No images from the site were released to the public. Details about the condition of the remains were classified. The reports documenting what investigators found, including the activated oxygen packs and the altered circuit breakers, were not publicized in any meaningful way. They existed in technical annexes to the Rogers Commission report, buried in hundreds of pages of engineering analysis and testimony. A determined researcher could find the information, but it was not presented in a manner that would catch media attention or enter public consciousness. Dr. Joseph Kerwin's biomedical report, which contained the most detailed information about the crew's fate, used notably cautious language when discussing consciousness. The report acknowledged evidence that some crew members survived the breakup, but it stopped short of stating definitively that they remained aware throughout the fall. Phrases like "cannot be determined with certainty" and "unknown duration" appeared frequently. This careful ambiguity allowed for multiple interpretations. NASA could say truthfully that it had investigated thoroughly and released its findings, while simultaneously avoiding the creation of a clear, simple narrative that the media could easily communicate to the public. The strategy succeeded in shaping public memory of the disaster. When most people think of Challenger today, they remember the iconic image of the forking contrails against blue sky. They remember the Teacher in Space program and Krista McAuliffe. They remember the O-rings and the cold weather. But very few people outside of aerospace professionals and dedicated researchers know about the 165 seconds. The long fall has been effectively erased from the collective understanding of what happened that day. This was concealment through disclosure, a technique where an organization releases so much technical information that the most significant human details become lost in the noise. NASA published thousands of pages of reports, held countless briefings, and answered innumerable questions about mechanical systems. But the agency never held a press conference specifically to discuss what the crew experienced during those final minutes. That question was left unanswered, not through silence, but through the careful management of where attention was directed and how information was framed. The families of the crew members were told more than the general public, but even they did not receive complete transparency about every detail. The agency had to balance honesty with mercy, providing enough information to answer questions while avoiding unnecessary anguish. It was an impossible position, and different families had different needs regarding how much they wanted to know. In the years since, some details have gradually emerged through Freedom of Information Act requests, through interviews with investigators, and through careful analysis of documents that were once obscure but have since been digitized and made searchable. The full picture has become clearer, but it has never entered mainstream awareness in the way that the initial explosion narrative did. The correction never catches up to the original story.